You wake up in the mud for a moment. You don't know where you are. Then the smell hits you. That distinctive mixture of rotting flesh, cordite, chloride of lime, and human waste that has become the perfume of your existence. You're in a trench, somewhere on the Western Front. And you have been here for what feels like forever. The year is 1916. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914 is now in its third year, and there is no end in sight. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a continuous line of trenches stretches for over 400 miles, a wound carved into the earth of France and Belgium. Millions of men live in these ditches, on both sides, waiting, suffering, dying. You are one of them. Your trench is about 7 feet deep and perhaps 6 feet wide at the bottom. The walls are reinforced with wooden planks, sandbags, and whatever else could be scrounged. Above you, the sky is gray. It's always gray here, or so it seems. Below you, the duckboards that form the floor float on inches of water and mud that never fully drains. The mud is everywhere. It's in your boots, your clothes, your food, your rifle. It's a living thing, this mud, and it wants to swallow you whole. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss another journey into historical darkness. And if you're already subscribed, you know the drill. Leave a like on this video. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. And honestly, surviving the algorithm is almost as hard as surviving the sun. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. You're standing in mud, trying to remember what dry feels like. The Great War, they don't call it World War I yet, because they don't know there will be a second one, has become something unprecedented in human history. It's not a war of movement and cavalry charges, of glory and quick victories. It's a war of attrition, of industrial slaughter, of men fed into a machine that grinds them up by the hundreds of thousands. The generals speak of breakthrough and victory, but the soldiers know the truth. This is a siege that stretches across a continent, and they are trapped inside it. You came here as a volunteer or a conscript, depending on when and where you joined. Maybe you believed the propaganda about adventure and honor. Maybe you just wanted to do your duty. Maybe you had no choice. None of that matters now. You're here, and the only thing that matters is surviving until tomorrow, and then surviving the day after that. And the day after that. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore what your life is like in this hellscape. The daily routines, the constant dangers, the small comforts and vast horrors. We're going to try to understand what it meant to be a soldier in the trenches of the First World War, living in conditions that would break most people, fighting a war that seemed to have no purpose and no end. This is the brutal reality of life in a WI trench. Get comfortable. The shelling is stopped for now, but it won't last. Nobody planned for this. Nobody imagined that the war would become what it became. When the guns of August 1914 began firing, everyone expected it to be over quickly. It started with an assassination. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. It was a political murder, the kind that had happened before without triggering global catastrophe. But this time, the dominoes fell differently. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and issued an ultimatum designed to be rejected. Russia mobilized to defend its Serbian allies. Germany mobilized to support Austria-Hungary and, following the long-planned Schlieffen Plan, invaded Belgium to attack France. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Within 6 weeks, most of Europe was at war. Everyone expected victory by Christmas. The Germans would sweep through Belgium, crush France in 6 weeks as they had in 1870, then turn east to deal with the slow mobilizing Russians. The French would launch their own offensive, elan and bayonets carrying the day. The British would add their small but professional army to the balance. Surely modern, civilized nations couldn't sustain a long war. The economic disruption alone would force a quick peace. They were wrong about everything. The German advance through Belgium was slowed by unexpected resistance. The French offensive in Alsace-Lorraine was a catastrophic failure, costing hundreds of thousands of casualties in the first month. The British Expeditionary Force fought brilliantly at Mons, but was forced to retreat. By September, the German army was within sight of Paris. Then came the miracle of the Marne. The French and British counterattacked, pushing the Germans back to the Aisne River. Both sides tried to outflank each other, racing north toward the sea. By November, the flanking maneuvers had reached the English Channel. There was nowhere left to go. Both armies began to dig in. The trenches were supposed to be temporary. They were field fortifications, expedient measures, while the generals figured out how to restart the war of movement. Nobody understood that the combination of machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire had made offensive warfare almost impossible. Nobody grasped that the trenches would become permanent, that men would live in them for years, that millions would die trying to advance a few hundred yards. Christmas 1914 came and went. The war continued. It would continue for 4 more years. The trenches weren't just ditches. They were a complex system of fortifications that evolved throughout the war, becoming ever more elaborate as both sides settled in Fourth Long Haul. The front-line trench, the fire trench, was where you faced the enemy. It wasn't straight. That would allow an enemy who captured one section to fire down the entire length. Instead, it zigzagged in a pattern called traverses, each section angled so that a shell burst or enemy breakthrough would be contained. You could rarely see more than 10 or 20 yards in either direction. The fire trench had a fire step, a raised platform along the front wall where soldiers stood to shoot over the parapet. The parapet itself was built up with sandbags, raising the front wall above ground level for additional protection. Behind you, the rear wall of the parados was also reinforced to protect against shells exploding behind the trench. Behind the fire trench, perhaps 50 to 100 yards back, ran the support trench. This is where reserve troops waited, ready to reinforce the front line or counterattack if the enemy broke through. The support trench was connected to the fire trench by communication trenches, narrow passages that allowed movement without exposing soldiers to enemy fire. Further back still, several hundred yards from the front, was the reserve trench. Here, troops rotated out of the front lines could rest, relatively speaking. The reserve trench was usually safer from direct fire, but still within range of artillery, and behind all of this stretched the rear areas. Supply depots, field hospitals, artillery positions, headquarters, billets in ruined villages. The infrastructure required to keep millions of men fighting was vast, and it extended for miles behind the front lines. The Germans generally had better trenches than the Allies. They had arrived first at many positions and chose the higher ground. They built deep dugouts, sometimes 30 feet underground, with concrete reinforcement, electric lighting, and even wallpaper. The British and French, committed to the offensive, to eventually driving the Germans out, were reluctant to make their trenches too comfortable. Why invest in fortifications you plan to abandon? The result was that Allied soldiers often lived in worse conditions, in shallower trenches with fewer amenities, while the Germans waited in relative comfort to mow them down. If you're enjoying this descent into the mud of the Western Front, take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I promise the conditions are about to get even worse. Building and maintaining the trenches was endless, back-breaking work. The earth didn't want to become a fortress. It wanted to collapse, to flood, to return to its natural state. Keeping the trenches functional required constant labor. New trenches were dug at night, when the darkness provided some protection from snipers and observers. Work parties went out into no man's land or extended existing positions, digging by hand with entrenching tools, small folding shovels that every soldier carried. The work was done in near silence, because sound carried in the night, and enemy machine guns were always ready. The soil varied depending on where you were. In some sectors, the ground was chalky and drained relatively well. In Flanders, in the Ypres salient, the ground was heavy clay that held water like a sponge. Dig down a few feet, and you hit the water table. The trenches in Flanders weren't really trenches at all. They were breastworks, walls built up above ground level, because digging down was impossible. Sandbags were the universal building material. Millions of them, filled with earth, stacked to reinforce walls, repair damage, build up parapets. Filling and placing sandbags was tedious work that never ended. A single artillery barrage could destroy in minutes what had taken days to build. Wooden planks called duckboards lined the trench floors, keeping soldiers' feet above the worst of the mud and water. Wooden frames called revetments held back the walls. Timber was always in short supply, scrounged from ruined buildings, brought up from the rear, hoarded like gold. The trenches also extended underground. Mining operations dug tunnels beneath enemy lines, packed them with explosives, and detonated them to create massive craters. Countermining operations listened for enemy diggers, trying to intercept them before they could complete their work. Some of the largest explosions in history before the atomic bomb were mine detonations on the Western Front. And always, the shells fell. A direct hit could collapse a section of trench, burying men alive. After every bombardment, the survivors had to dig out the dead and rebuild what had been destroyed, knowing it would all happen again tomorrow. Life in the trenches followed a rigid routine. In the chaos and terror, routine provided structure, something to hold on to, a way to impose order on the incomprehensible. The day began before dawn with stand to. An hour before sunrise, every man in the front-line trench was roused from whatever sleep he'd managed and ordered to the fire step, rifle loaded, bayonet fixed. This was the most dangerous time of day, dawn, and dusk, or when attacks were most likely, when the light was tricky, when a massed assault might emerge from the morning mist stand that lasted about an hour, until full daylight made a surprise attack impossible. Then came stand down, and with it, the most welcome ritual of the day, the rum ration. Each man received a small measure of strong naval rum, issued by the sergeant, drunk under supervision to prevent hoarding. in the cold and wet and terror of the trenches. That burning mouthful of alcohol was sometimes the only warmth you felt all day. After rum came breakfast, such as it was. Tea brewed in Dixie's large metal containers, bacon, if you were lucky, biscuits and jam if you weren't. The food was cooked behind the lines and brought up before dawn. In the front trenches, lighting a fire was impossible. The morning was for inspection and chores. Officers checked rifles, ammunition, equipment. Working parties repaired damage from the night's shelling, reinforced weak points, improved drainage. Sentries watched no man's land through Periskopesh while their comrades worked. The afternoon was for rest, at least in theory. Men slept when they could, huddled in dugouts or funk holes, small cavities carved into the trench walls. They wrote letters, played cards, read. They tried to stay dry, stay warm, stay sane. That evening brought another stand to, another hour of vigilance as the sun set. Then darkness, and with it, the real work of the trenches began. Night was when patrols went out, when supplies came up, when the dead were buried, when the wire was repaired. Night was when you could move without being shot, though the flares that arced across no man's land could catch you in their harsh light at any moment. And a few hours of sleep, interrupted by sentry duty, by shelling, by the screams of wounded men in no man's land. Then dawn again and stand to, and the whole cycle repeated. Let's talk about what you're wearing and carrying, because it's going to be on your body for days or weeks at a time, and it will determine whether you live or die. The British soldier wore khaki serge, a wool uniform that was hot in summer, inadequate in winter, and perpetually damp. The tunic had brass buttons that had to be kept polished, a pointless formality that some officers insisted upon, even in the trenches. Puttee's long strips of wool wound around the lower legs were supposed to provide support and keep mud out of your boots. They did neither particularly well. The most important piece of equipment was the steel helmet, but you might not have one yet. The British Brodie helmet wasn't introduced until 1916. Before that, soldiers wore soft caps that offered no protection against shrapnel, the biggest killer on the Western Front. When helmets did arrive, they reduced head wounds dramatically. The French had their Adrian helmet, the Germans their distinctive Stahlhelm. You carry a Lee Enfield rifle, a bolt-action weapon that holds 10 rounds and can be fired accurately at 15 rounds per minute by a trained soldier. Your bayonet is 18 inches of steel that you hope you'll never have to use. Bayonet fighting is rare, terrifying, and medieval. You carry 150 rounds of ammunition, a haversack with your personal effects, a water bottle, a gas mask, an entrenching tool, a mess kit, a ground sheet, and whatever else has been issued or scrounged. The full kit weighs about 60 pounds. You will carry it everywhere, through mud that sucks at your boots, up ladders, across shell-torn ground. You will sleep in it, fight in it, die in it. The gas mask evolved throughout the war. Early versions were little more than cotton pads soaked in chemicals, held over the face. Later came the box respirator with its separate filter unit, more effective but claustrophobic and difficult to fight in. Putting on your mask quickly became a matter of life and death. You had seconds after the alarm was raised, get it sealed against your face. Your boots are crucial. They're leather, supposedly waterproof. Actually nothing of the kind. After a few days in the trenches, they will be sodden. Your socks will be rotting, and your feet will begin the slow process of deterioration that leads to trench foot. You will do anything for dry socks. Dry socks are more valuable than gold. If you're settling in for the night, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment, because we're about to discuss the cuisine of the trenches, and you'll want something to distract you from the mental images. The British soldier's diet was monotonous, inadequate, and often disgusting. But it kept you alive, mostly. And that was about all you could ask. The staple was bully beef corned beef in tins, salty and greasy, and exactly the same whether you opened it in France or Mesopotamia. You ate it cold more often than not, straight from the tin, because hot food required cooking facilities that frontline trenches didn't have. Bully beef was fine the first few times. After weeks and months of it, the sight of another tin made you want to retch. Hardtack biscuits, hardtack, dog biscuits, whatever you called them, were the other constant. They were so hard that soldiers sometimes had to break them with rifle butts. Soaked in tea or stew, they became marginally edible. Dry, they could crack your teeth. They were, however, nearly indestructible and provided calories, which was the point. The official ration was supposed to include bread, fresh meat, vegetables, cheese, jam, and tea. In practice, what you actually received depended on supply lines, enemy shelling, and the competence of your quartermaster. Fresh food rarely reached the front trenches in edible condition. The bread, when it arrived, was often stale or moldy. The meat might be days old. The vegetables existed in theory. Tea was the universal solace. The British Army ran on tea, sweetened with condensed milk, brewed in any container available. Tea was warm, it was familiar, it was something from home. The tea ration was never cut, no matter how bad things got, because the generals understood that some things were essential to morale. Hot food, when it came, was brought up at night in insulated containers. Stew, mostly McConaughey, a tinned meat and vegetable combination that was edible when hot and revolting when cold, which it usually was by the time it reached you. The carrying parties had to navigate communication trenches under fire, and the food often arrived late, cold, or not at all. Parcels from home were treasured. Chocolate, cake, tinned delicacies, real food that reminded you that another world existed. The parcels often arrived crushed, sodden, or partially looted, but what survived was shared and savored. Hunger was your constant companion. Not starvation. The army kept you alive, but that persisted. Knowing hunger that came from never quite getting enough. From burning calories in cold and labor, while subsisting on bully beef and hardtack. The mud of the Western Front was not ordinary mud. It was a substance unto itself, a malevolent presence that shaped every aspect of trench life. Veterans spoke of it as if it were alive. An enemy as dangerous as the Germans. In Flanders, the mud was worst. The area around Ypres had been reclaimed from the sea, drained by a system of canals and ditches that the shelling destroyed. The water table sat just below the surface. Dig a hole, and it filled with water. Walk off the duckboards, and you sank to your knees, your waist, sometimes your chest. Men drowned in the mud of Flanders, trapped and unable to free themselves, sinking slowly while their comrades watched helplessly. The mud got into everything. It clogged rifle mechanisms, jamming weapons at crucial moments. It filled boots and rotted feet. It made movement exhausting. Every step required pulling your foot free from the sucking grip of the earth. Men spent hours crossing distances that would take minutes on solid ground. The mud mixed with other things. with blood, with human waste from the latrines that overflowed during bombardments, with the decaying flesh of the dead who were buried in the trench walls or lost in no man's land. The mud of the Western Front was composed partly of corpses, and everyone knew it. Whole units got stuck in the mud during attacks. Soldiers loaded with equipment tried to advance across ground churned by shellfire, ground that had been fought over for months or years, and they simply sank. Machine guns found them there, struggling, unable to take cover, unable to move. At Passchendaele in 1917, the battlefield became a swamp that swallowed men, horses, guns, tanks. The gains were measured in yards, the casualties in hundreds of thousands. Getting wounded in the mud was a death sentence if you couldn't get out. Stretcher bearers couldn't cross the worst ground. Men lay in shell holes, injured, watching the mud rise around them, calling for help that couldn't come. Some shot themselves rather than drown slowly. Some were shot by friends who couldn't bear to watch. The mud never dried. It never went away. It was always there, cold and wet and hungry, waiting to claim you. The trenches were infested with rats. Not ordinary rats, but monsters fattened on the abundant food source that the war provided. Human corpses. They came in two varieties. There were brown rats and black rats, and the soldiers hated them both. But the brown rats were bigger, bolder, more numerous. They grew to enormous sizes, some as large as cats, gorged on the flesh of the dead. They ran across sleeping men in the night. They got into the food supplies. They were everywhere, always a constant rustling presence in the darkness. The rats ate the dead first, starting with the eyes and liver, working through the softer tissues. Bodies buried in the trench walls weren't safe from them. The rats tunneled in, gnawed at the remains, emerged fat and satisfied. Bodies in no man's land were consumed openly, the rats fighting over the choicest parts, while flares lit the scene in harsh, flickering light. Soldiers tried everything to kill them. They bayoneted them, shot them when regulations against wasting ammunition were relaxed, beat them with clubs and entrenching tools. They set traps, poisoned bait, brought in terriers and cats. Nothing worked. The food supply was infinite, the breeding population beyond control. For every rat killed, 10 more appeared. The rats spread disease. They contaminated food and water with their droppings. They bit sleeping soldiers, leaving wounds that became infected. They were vectors for everything that could make you sick in an environment already full of pathogens. But the psychological effect was perhaps worst. The rats were a constant reminder of death, of what awaited you, of what would happen to your body if you fell. They were a violation of human dignity, these creatures that fed on your friends, that treated human remains as just another food source. Men who could face shell fire and machine guns were reduced to shaking fury by the rats. Some soldiers made a sport of killing them, betting on how many they could dispatch in a night. Some developed an odd tolerance, accepting them as just another feature of trench life. None ever forgot them. In the nightmares that followed the survivors home, the rats were always there. The rats were horrifying, but at least you could see them, fight them, occasionally kill one. The lice were worse because they were inescapable. They lived on your body, in your clothing, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about them. Every soldier had lice. Every single one, from private to general. The lice lived in the seams of your uniform, in your underclothing, in any fold or crevice they could find. They emerged to feed on your blood, leaving red, itchy welts that drove you mad with scratching. They bred in the warmth of your body, laying eggs that hatched into more lice that fed and bred in term dot. The infestation began within days of arriving at the front. No matter how clean you were when you came, no matter how carefully you washed, the lice found you. They spread from man to man, from bedding to body, from one uniform to another. They were as universal as the mud, as constant as the sound of artillery. Soldiers called the process of picking lice from clothing, chatting, hunting for the little chats that infested the seams. It was a social activity, men sitting together, cracking lice between their thumbnails, a never-ending battle that could never be won. You could pick your uniform clean, relatively clean only, to find yourself re-infested hours later from your bedding, your neighbor, the very trench walls. The lice carried disease. Trench fever, a debilitating illness that caused high fever, severe headache, and leg pain, was spread by louse feces entering the bites. It rarely killed, but it incapacitated, taking soldiers out of the line for weeks or months. In a war of attrition that mattered not, the only real relief came when you rotated out of the trenches. Behind the lines, the lousing stations used heat and chemicals to kill the lice and their eggs. You got a hot bath, sometimes your first in weeks. You got clean clothes. And then you went back up to the line, and within days, you were infested again. The itching was constant. The scratching was constant. The lice were always there, feeding, breeding, reminding you that your body was not your own, that even your skin belonged to the war. If you're still with me in this descent into misery, take a moment to hit subscribe. Your support helps me create more historical deep dives for your bedtime listening. And speaking of things that will keep you up at night, let's talk about trench foot. Your feet were always wet. In the waterlogged trenches, there was no way to keep them dry. The water seeped through your boots, soaked your socks, and stayed there, a cold, clammy presence that never went away. After hours and days of this, your feet began to change. Trench foot started with numbness. Your feet went cold and lost feeling. The skin turned red, then blue, then white. The blood vessels constricted, trying to preserve heat, reducing circulation to the extremities. If it went on long enough, the tissues began to die dot in advanced cases. The feet swelled grotesquely. The skin blistered, then blackened. Gangrene set in, the flesh rotting while still attached to the living body. The smell was distinctive, sweet, sickly, unmistakable. At that point, the only treatment was amputation. Men lost toes, feet, legs, to a condition that was entirely preventable, but impossible to prevent in trench conditions. The medical officers knew what caused it, and they knew how to stop it. Keep the feet dry. Change socks regularly. Massage and warm the feet. Oil them with whale oil or other waterproofing agents. In theory, simple. In practice, when you're standing in a flooded trench under shell fire, when dry socks are unavailable, when you can't take your boots off for days at a time, impossible. The army tried to address it. Whale oil was issued, and men were required to apply it and massage their feet daily. Officers inspected feet, checking for early signs. Duck boards were improved, drainage attempted. The incidence of trench foot decreased as the war went on, as prevention methods improved and enforcement increased. But it never went away. Thousands of soldiers lost feet to a condition that should never have existed. a condition created entirely by the circumstances of the war. In hierarchy of trench miseries, trench foot ranked near the top, not because it was the most dangerous, but because it was so utterly, stupidly preventable. And yet it happened anyway. Every veteran of the trenches remembered the smell. Decades later, a particular odor could trigger memories, could send a man back to the Western Front in an instant. The smell of the trenches was unique, unforgettable, and absolutely overpowering. The bass note was death. The dead were everywhere buried, in the trench walls, lying in no man's land, turned up by every artillery barrage. Decomposition in the damp conditions was slow, and the smell of rotting flesh permeated everything. You ate with that smell in your nostrils. You slept with it. You breathed it with every breath. Eventually, you stopped noticing it, which was perhaps the most disturbing adaptation of all. Layered on top of the death was the smell of the living, unwashed bodies, weeks without bathing, uniforms stiff with dried sweat and worse. The latrines ditches dug off the main trench, often overflowing, always inadequate, added their contribution. Men with dysentery couldn't always make it to the latrines. The trenches smelled of shit, always. Then there was the mud itself, that particular smell of churned earth mixed with blood and decay. The creosote used to treat the wooden supports. The chloride of lime scattered as disinfectant, a harsh chemical smell that caught in the throat. The smoke from cooking fires and shell explosions. The distinctive odor of cordite from fired weapons. Gas attacks added their own signatures. Chlorine smelled like a swimming pool. A domestic smell turned deadly. Phosgene smelled like fresh-cut hay. Mustard gas smelled like garlic or horseradish. Men learned to identify these scents instantly, because recognition could mean the difference between life and death. And underneath it all, always, was the smell of fear. Adrenaline has a smell, and so does the particular sweat of terrified men. It's a smell that soldiers recognized, fattled them when things were about to get very bad. The senses adapt. After a while, you stop smelling most of it, the way you stop noticing any constant odor. But when you left the trenches, when you rotated back to the rear areas, the first thing you noticed was the absence, the clean air, the normal smells, the world as it was supposed to be. And then you went back, and the smell wrapped around you again, like a shroud dot between your trench and the enemy's lay, a strip of earth that belonged to no one. This was no man's land, and it was one of the most dangerous places on earth. The distance varied from sector to sector. In some places, the opposing trenches were over 500 yards apart. In others, particularly around strategic points that both sides wanted, they might be as close as 50 yards near enough to hear the enemy talking, to smell their cigarettes, to throw grenades. No man's land was defined by its features, all of them deadly. First, the barbed wire massive entanglements, sometimes 100 yards deep, designed to slow attackers so the machine guns could cut them down. The wire was strung on wooden or metal posts, layer after layer, the barbs designed to tear flesh and snag clothing. Cutting through it under fire was almost impossible. The ground itself was churned by constant, shelling into a moonscape of overlapping craters. These craters provided the only cover in no man's land, and they were often full of water. Men sheltered in them during attacks, drowning when wounded, using the bodies of the dead as stepping stones. The dead were everywhere. Men who had fallen in previous attacks, Men who had died on patrol, men who had been shot as they tried to repair the wire. They lay where they fell because recovering bodies under fire was suicide. They decomposed, turning to skeletons, their equipment scattered around them. After a while, the bones became just another feature of the landscape. Crossing no man's land in daylight was suicide. Snipers watched every inch of it. Machine guns could sweep the entire space. Artillery had every coordinate registered. Moving in daylight meant dying out at night. No man's land came alive. Patrols crept out to gather intelligence, to capture prisoners for interrogation, to raid enemy positions. Working parties repaired the wire, improved positions, buried the dead when possible. Stretcher bearers searched for the wounded who might still be saved. These night operations were terrifying. You moved in absolute darkness, navigating by touch and memory, freezing when the flares went up and bathed everything in harsh white light. One wrong step could send you tumbling into a crater or tangled in the wire. One sound could bring a burst of machine gun fire sweeping across your position dot. No man's land was the essence of the war. A space that neither side could occupy. A space that devoured anyone who entered it. A space that existed only to be crossed at enormous cost. For gains measured in yards, you learned very quickly never to raise your head above the parapet. Never. Not even for a second. Not even when everything was quiet. Because somewhere out there, a man with a rifle and a telescopic sight was waiting for exactly that moment. Snipers were the most feared soldiers on the Western Front. Both sides employed them. Germans were particularly skilled, often using specially modified rifles with optical sights. They concealed themselves in camouflaged positions, sometimes in no man's land itself, and they waited. They were patient. They had nothing but time. The sniper's job was to make life in the trenches unbearable. He couldn't kill everyone, but he could kill anyone who got careless. He shot men who lit cigarettes at night, the match flame visible from hundreds of yards. He shot men who moved predictably, using the same route at the same time. He shot men who simply forgot, for one moment, where they were. The psychological effect was enormous. Knowing that every exposed inch of your trench was under observation, that any movement might be your last, created a constant low-level stress that never went away. Men developed a hunched posture, keeping their heads down instinctively, even when they were miles from the front. The sniper was always there, even when he wasn't dot to observe the enemy without dying. The periscope became essential. These were simple devices, 2 mirrors, mounted in a wooden or metal frame that allowed you to see over the parapet without exposing yourself. Every section of trench had at least one. Specialized periscopes with built-in telescopes or rifle mounts were developed. The Germans knew about the periscopes. Of course, they shot at them, trying to destroy them, trying to deny the enemy the ability to observe. A moving periscope was an obvious target. Skilled snipers could put a bullet through the mirror at remarkable distances. Some soldiers became counter-snipers, hunting the hunters. They used decoys helmets on sticks, dummy heads that could be raised to draw fire and reveal the sniper's position. They calculated trajectories from bullet holes, triangulated positions, set up their own ambushes. The sniper war was a war within the war, personal and deadly. The veterans had a saying, "Curiosity killed the cat." In the trenches, curiosity killed soldiers, one raised head at a time. The human mind was not designed to endure what the trenches demanded. Hour after hour, day after day, the shelling, the fear, the death eventually. Something had to give. The breakdown was called shell shock, and it was as much a casualty of the war as any bullet wound. Shell shock presented in many ways. Some men shook uncontrollably, tremor so severe they couldn't hold a rifle, couldn't feed themselves, couldn't walk. Some went blind or deaf without any physical injury. Some became paralyzed, unable to move their limbs despite intact nerves and muscles. Some couldn't speak, rendered mute by experiences no words could express. Some simply broke down, weeping, screaming, unable to function. The military authorities didn't understand it. Many didn't want to understand it. Shell shock looked like cowardice, like men who had lost their nerve, who were refusing to do their duty. Courts-martial sentenced shell-shocked soldiers to death for desertion or cowardice, executing men whose only crime was having minds that couldn't absorb any more horror. Gradually, the understanding improved. Doctors realized that shell shock was a medical condition, not a moral failing. Rest, treatment, time away from the front could help some cases. Others never recovered, spending the rest of their lives in institutions, still fighting a war that had ended decades before. The term we use now is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The trenches produced it on an industrial scale. The constant bombardment, the random death, the sight of friends torn apart, the killing at close quarters, the inescapable stress. These were precisely the conditions that caused psychological damage. The surprise isn't that so many broke. The surprise is that anyone came through psychologically intact, and many who seemed intact weren't. They came home and couldn't sleep, couldn't hold jobs, couldn't connect with families who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand. They drank to forget. They woke screaming from nightmares. They flinched at loud noises for the rest of their lives. The war followed them home and never left. The shell-shocked soldiers were the visible evidence of what the trenches did to the human spirit. But they were only the extreme cases. Everyone who served there was damaged to some degree. The trenches broke everyone. It was only a question of how obviously, how completely. If you're still listening, take a moment to subscribe and prepare yourself, because we're about to discuss what many veterans considered the most terrifying weapon of the war. On April 22, 1915, near Ypres, German troops opened the valves on thousands of cylinders and released 168 tons of chlorine gas into the wind. A yellow-green cloud, 5 miles wide, drifted across no man's land toward the French and Algerian troops on the other side. The soldiers had never seen anything like it. They had no protection. They died by the thousands, lungs destroyed by the corrosive gas, drowning in the fluid their own bodies produced. Gas warfare had arrived. The initial attack used chlorine, which destroyed lung tissue on contact. It was heavy, sinking into trenches and dugouts where men tried to shelter. The effects were horrific. Burning eyes, choking, frothing at the mouth, suffocation as the lungs filled with fluid. Those who survived a severe chlorine exposure were often permanently disabled, their lungs scarred, unable to breathe properly for the rest of their lives. That both sides developed and used gas throughout the war. Phosgene was more deadly than chlorine, but less detectable. It smelled like fresh hay, a pleasant scent that gave no warning. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, was different. It didn't kill immediately, but caused terrible burns on exposed skin. Temporary or permanent blindness if it reached the eyes, and long-term lung damage. It persisted for days, contaminating the ground, making trenches uninhabitable. Gas masks evolved rapidly. The early expedients cotton pads, soaked in bicarbonate, cloth hoods with chemical filters, gave way to the box respirator, a mask connected by hose to a filter, carried in a bag. The box respirator was effective if donned quickly enough, and if the filter wasn't exhausted. The problem was quickly enough. You had seconds after the alarm to get your mask on and sealed. The alarm was usually a bell, a gong, a klaxon, anything that could be heard. When it sounded, you grabbed your mask, stopped breathing, pulled it over your head, and prayed. If you were too slow, if your mask was damaged, if the seal wasn't perfect, the gas got in. And then you died badly. Gas accounted for perhaps 1 million casualties during the war, including about 100,000 deaths. The numbers were smaller than artillery casualties, but the psychological impact was disproportionate. Gas was invisible, terrifying, indiscriminate. It could kill you in your sleep. It violated something fundamental about warfare, the idea that you could see your enemy, could fight back. Against gas, you could only try to hide. The whistle blows. You have been waiting for this moment for hours, maybe days, knowing it was coming, dreading it, wishing it would be called off, wishing it would just happen so the waiting would end. And now it's here, and you have to move. Going over the top meant climbing out of the relative safety of the trench and advancing across no man's land toward the enemy positions. It was the defining experience of the war, the moment everything had been building toward, the moment that killed more men than any other dot in the minutes before the attack. The artillery barrage would lift, shifting from the enemy front line to the support trenches beyond. This was your signal, and also the enemy's. They knew exactly what the lifting barrage meant, and they were already climbing out of their deep dugouts, setting up their machine guns. Preparing to receive you, you climbed a ladder or scrambled over the top. Equipment banging, 60 pounds of kit on your back. The officers led, whistles in their mouths, revolvers in their hands. You formed up in a line with your mates, the men you trained with, lived with, the men you would die with. Then you walked. Not ran, walked. The theory was that a steady advance kept the formation together, kept the men under control. The reality was that loaded down soldiers couldn't run through the mud and the craters anyway. So you walked, upright, in neat lines, toward machine guns that could fire 600 rounds a minute. The machine guns opened up. Men fell. The man beside you was there, and then he wasn't, and you kept walking because there was nothing else to do. Shells exploded, throwing up fountains of earth and bodies. You stumbled into craters, climbed out, kept going. The wire was ahead, and if the artillery hadn't cut it, and it usually hadn't, you were trapped there, trying to find a way through while the bullets tore through your ranks. If you made it to the enemy trench, the fighting was brutal and personal. Bayonets, clubs, fists, anything that could kill at close range. The trenches were full of smoke and screaming. Impossible to tell friend from foe. Impossible to know if you were winning or dying. Most attacks failed. The casualties were absorbed. The survivors retreated or were pushed back by counterattacks, and the line moved not at all. Thousands dead for 100 yards of mud that would be lost in the next attack from the other side. the weapon that made the trenches necessary. That made offensive warfare suicidal. That killed more men than any other technology. The machine gun. The Germans had the Maxim, which they called the MG08. The British had the Vickers. The French had the Hotchkiss. They all worked on similar principles. A mechanism that used the recoil of each shot to load and fire the next, allowing a single weapon to fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Where a rifleman could fire 15 aimed shots in a minute, a machine gun could fire 600. The mathematics were merciless. A single machine gun with a clear field of fire could stop a battalion. 2 machine guns with interlocking fields of fire could stop a brigade. The German defensive doctrine positioned machine guns to create overlapping kill zones, ensuring that attackers would be hit from multiple directions simultaneously. There was no cover in no man's land, no way to advance without crossing those beaten zones. The machine guns fired on fixed lines, predetermined arcs that covered the likely avenues of approach. The gunners didn't need to aim at individuals. They simply swept their weapons back and forth, knowing that anyone in the path of those bullets would be hit. At night, they fired along the same lines, trusting to probability that any patrol or attack would walk into the stream of bullets. The sound of the machine gun became the Yammi, defining sound of the war. The British called the German guns typewriters for their rapid clatter. The Germans nicknamed their weapons the Devil's Paintbrush for the way they swept across the battlefield. Soldiers learned to distinguish between different models, to estimate range and direction from the sound, to know when they were in the beaten zone and when they were not. Countermeasures were attempted. Artillery tried to destroy machine gun positions before attacks, but the guns were often in deep dugouts that shells couldn't reach. Tanks were developed partly to overcome the machine gun, crawling across no man's land, immune to bullets. Infiltration tactics, bypassing strong points rather than attacking them directly, eventually proved effective. But for most of the war, the machine gun ruled. It was the reason millions of men lived in trenches, the reason attacks failed, the reason the line barely moved for years. The machine gun had changed warfare forever, and the generals were still learning that lesson on the bodies of their soldiers. Artillery killed more soldiers in the First World War than any other weapon, more than machine guns. More than rifles, more than gas. The shells fell constantly, a barrage that could last hours, days, sometimes weeks, shattering bodies and minds with equal efficiency. The numbers beggar comprehension. At the Battle of Verdun in 1916, the two sides fired over 60 million shells at each other. At the Somme, the British fired 1.5 million shells in the week before the attack, and it wasn't enough to destroy the German defenses. Artillery barrages consumed shells faster than factories could produce them, creating ammunition crises that shaped strategy. The shells came in many varieties. High explosive fragmented into shrapnel, metal shards that could kill or maim at dozens of yards from the point of impact. Shrapnel shells burst in the air, spraying steel balls downward onto troops in the open. Gas hulls delivered their poison payloads across wide areas. Massive siege guns fired shells heavy enough to destroy concrete bunkers. You heard the shells before they arrived, usually. A high-pitched whistle meant the shell was passing overhead, aimed at something behind you. A deeper sound, a rushing, a roar, meant it was coming down on your position. There were seconds to react, to throw yourself into a dugout or shell hole, to pray. Or there was nothing at all, Just an explosion, and then silence. The shell that arrived faster than sound, killing before you knew it was coming. The barrages were terrifying in ways that words struggle to convey. The ground shook constantly. The noise was so loud it deafened. Literally, many veterans had permanent hearing loss. The world became a chaos of explosions, debris, screaming, the concussive blast that rattled your brain inside your skull. Men were buried alive when shells collapsed trenches. Men were torn to pieces so completely that nothing remained to bury. Men simply disappeared. The psychological effect was as damaging as the physical. You couldn't fight back against artillery. You couldn't see your enemy. You could only endure, huddled in your dugout, waiting for it to end, knowing that the next shell might be the one that found you. Men prayed. Men went mad. Men sat in perfect stillness for hours, catatonic, their minds simply refusing to process any more. After a heavy barrage, the survivors emerged into a transformed landscape. Trenches were collapsed, dugouts buried, bodies everywhere. You started digging, rebuilding, preparing to receive the attack that usually followed the barrage. And then the shelling started again, docked in the midst of all this horror. You tried to maintain a connection to the world you had left behind. You wrote letters home to parents, to wives, to sweethearts, and those letters were sometimes the only thing that kept you sane. But you couldn't write the truth. The military censors read every letter that left the front, and anything that might damage morale or reveal military information was cut out or caused the entire letter to be confiscated. You couldn't describe where you were when attacks were planned, how many men you'd lost. You couldn't describe the lice, the rats, the mud, the terror. You couldn't tell your mother what you'd seen or your wife what you'd done not, so you wrote around the truth. You wrote that you were keeping well when you were sick and starving. You wrote about the weather, the food, the amusing antics of your mates. You wrote cheerful lies because the truth was unprintable and because worrying your family served no purpose anyway. What could they do? The formula developed. I am well. Hope you are the same. Weather has been fair. Give my love to everyone. 100 variations on the same empty reassurance, written by men who were living through hell, addressed to people who couldn't begin to imagine it. Some men found ways to communicate more honestly. Prearranged codes let them tell their families where they were. Certain phrases meant certain sectors. Some wrote in ways that slipped past censors who didn't know the family context. Some simply didn't care anymore and wrote what they wanted, accepting the consequences. The letters from home were precious. They arrived in batches, sometimes weeks' worth at once, sometimes nothing for long periods. They told of ordinary life births, deaths, marriages, the price of bread, the neighbor's garden. They were unbearably distant, these concerns of a world that had continued without you, a world you could barely remember. Some letters brought terrible news. A father had died. A brother had been killed on another front. A wife had left, unable to bear the waiting any longer. These letters destroyed men more effectively than shells, reaching through the military mail system to shatter whatever remained of their will to endure. And some men got the worst letter of all, the one informing them that a previous letter had been their last, that the person they'd been writing to would never read their words, never write back. The connection to home severed forever. You didn't stay in the frontline trenches continuously. The army rotated units. cycling them through positions to give them time to rest, to recover, to remember what it felt like to be something other than a target. The standard rotation, at least in theory, was 4 days in the front line, 4 days in the support trenches, 4 days in reserve, 4 days at rest behind the lines. In practice, it varied enormously depending on the sector, the availability of replacements, the tempo of operations. Some units spent weeks in the trenches without relief. Others rotated quickly when their sector was quiet. The support trenches, 50 to 100 yards behind the front line, were marginally safer. You were still under artillery fire, still close enough to be called forward if there was an attack. But the machine guns couldn't reach you, and the snipers had other targets. You slept more, worked on fortifications, waited. The reserve trenches were safer still. Here you could move more freely, sleep more soundly, eat hot food more often. You were still within the trench system, still wearing your kit, still listening to the guns. But the immediate threat receded. You could almost relax. True rest came only in the rear areas, the towns and villages behind the front, where soldiers went to recover. Here there were Estamines's French cafes that catered to soldiers, selling wine and beer and egg and chips, providing a taste of civilian life. There were concert parties, sports, organized recreation, and there was simply time to sleep in a real bed, to get clean, to feel human again. But rest was never really restful. You couldn't shake the feeling that you should still be there, with the men who were still in the line. You couldn't stop flinching at loud noises, couldn't stop scanning for cover. The civilians looked at you with something between gratitude and fear, and you couldn't explain yourself to them, couldn't bridge the gap between their world and yours, Dot. And always the knowledge that rest would end, that in a few days you'd be marching back up to the line, back to the mud and the shells and the waiting. The rest was temporary. The trenches were forever. If you're settling in for the night, subscribe and leave a comment about where you're listening from. Because now we're going to talk about the one thing that made the trenches survivable, the men beside you. The bonds formed in the trenches were unlike anything in civilian life. You lived with these men, ate with them, slept beside them, fought beside them. You knew their fears, their hopes, their stories about home. You knew their faces in the dark, their voices in the chaos, the sound of their breathing when everything was quiet. This was more than friendship. The German word Kameradschaft captured something of it, a comradeship forged in shared suffering, tested in mortal danger, deeper than anything that existed before or would exist after. You would die for these men, and they would die for you, and that knowledge was absolute. The small unit, the section, the platoon, the company became your family. Officers might be distant, generals invisible, but the men immediately around you were everything. You shared what you had, covering for each other's weaknesses, celebrating each other's small victories. When the food was short, you divided it equally. When the rum ration came, you made sure everyone got their share. You also shared the killing. When you went over the top, the man beside you was the one who saved your life, who shot the German about to bayonet you, who dragged you into a shell hole when you were hit. And you did the same for him. You killed together, survived together, bore the weight of it together. Losing a close comrade was devastating. Men who could face their own death with equanimity fell apart when their friends were killed. Some became reckless, courting death as if it didn't matter anymore. Some became numb, refusing to form new attachments. protecting themselves from more loss. Some carried the guilt forever. Why did he die and not me? After the war, veterans sought each other out. They formed associations, held reunions, maintained the bonds even as civilians forgot. They couldn't explain to their families what they'd been through, but with each other, they didn't need to explain. The shared experience was enough. This brotherhood was the heart of trench warfare. It was why men kept fighting when everything reasonable said they should stop. Not for king and country, not for abstract causes, but for the man beside them, who was counting on them, who would have done the same in the first winter of the war, before the trenches became permanent. Before the hatred had set in, something extraordinary happened. Men on both sides laid down their weapons and celebrated Christmas together. It began on Christmas Eve. Along sections of the front, German soldiers began placing candles on their parapets, decorating their trenches with small Christmas trees. They began singing carols, Still Nacht, O Tannenbaum, and the British soldiers listened and responded with their own songs. Across no man's land, enemies serenaded each other. On Christmas Day, in places scattered along the front, men began climbing out of the trenches. They met in no man's land, unarmed, uncertain, curious about the enemy they had been trying to kill. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons, badges. They showed each other photographs of their families. They buried the dead who had lain between the lines. In at least one location, the soldiers organized a football match. German versus British, played in the cratered mud of no man's land, using whatever could serve as a ball. The score was disputed. No one really cared. What mattered was the playing, the normality of it, the reminder that the men on the other side were just like them. The truce was unofficial, unauthorized, deplored by high command on both sides. Officers threatened courts-martial for anyone who participated. But it happened anyway, because the men at the front needed it. Because for one day, they wanted to be human beings instead of soldiers. The truce ended. Some accounts say it simply wound down as the day went on, men returning to their trenches as darkness fell. Others say officers ordered the resumption of hostilities. In some sectors, the informal ceasefire extended for days. Neither side willing to shoot first. It never happened again on the same scale. The bitterness deepened. Gas attacks, atrocities, the accumulating dead all made the enemy inhuman again. The high commands made sure it wouldn't happen again, rotating troops so they wouldn't become too familiar with their opponents. But the Christmas truce became a legend. It was proof that underneath the uniforms, the men in the trenches recognized each other as human beings. It was proof that the war didn't have to be this way, that the killing was a choice, that peace was possible, which made the resumption of the killing on December 26th and every day after that much more tragic. July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the day that would become synonymous with the futility and horror of the First World War. The plan was simple enough. A massive artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses, cut the wire, kill or demoralize the defenders. Then the infantry would advance across no man's land and occupy the shattered German trenches. Breakthrough would follow. The cavalry would pour through, and the war of movement would resume. The bombardment lasted 7 days. Over 1.5 million shells fell on the German positions, an average of 1 shell every second. The noise could be heard in London. The British commanders were confident. Surely nothing could survive such destruction. They were wrong. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some 30 feet underground, reinforced with concrete. When the bombardment lifted, they emerged from shelter, set up their machine guns, and waited. The wire, supposedly cut by the shelling, was largely intact. The shells had often thrown it into the air, only for it to come down even more tangled heaps. The defensive positions, supposedly destroyed, were damaged but functional. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along the British front. 100,000 men climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. The machine guns opened up. In the first hour, whole battalions ceased to exist. Men walked into interlocking fields of fire, caught on uncut wire, fell in waves. Some units took 90% casualties before they'd advanced 100 yards. The Newfoundland Regiment was effectively wiped out. Of 780 men who attacked, 684 were killed or wounded in less than 30 minutes. By the end of the day, the British had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead. It was the worst day in the history of the British Army. Some small gains had been made in the south, where the artillery had been more effective, but overall, the line had barely moved. The battle continued for 4 more months, a grinding attrition that produced over 1 million total casualties on both sides. The maximum advance was about 6 miles. The cost per yard was almost impossible to calculate. The sum became the symbol of the wars: futility. Brave men sent to die by generals who didn't understand what they were asking, sacrificed for gains so small they couldn't be seen on a map. How did anyone survive? Partly skill, partly luck, mostly luck. The soldiers knew this, and knowing it, they developed a complex relationship with fate, luck, and the forces that might or might not control their destiny. Superstitions flourished in the trenches. Men carried Lucky Charms coins, photographs, letters, religious medals, rabbits' feet. They avoided certain behaviors that they believed brought bad luck. Lighting 3 cigarettes with 1 match. The third man would be shot by a sniper who had located the flame. Saying certain words, performing actions in certain orders. They developed rituals, doing things the same way every time because doing it differently might tempt fate. Some superstitions had practical origins. The 3 cigarettes thing was plausible. A sniper might need time to locate a light source and aim. Keeping your head down was common sense, but it became almost religious, a ritual of survival. Others were purely psychological, ways of imposing order on randomness, of believing that survival was controllable. Religion offered comfort to many. Men who had been indifferent believers before the war became devout, praying before attacks, thanking God for each day survived. Others lost their faith entirely. How could a loving God permit this? The chaplains worked to maintain morale, holding services, counseling the frightened, burying the dead with whatever dignity was possible. The fatalists accepted that survival was random. If there's a bullet with your name on it, there's nothing you can do. This could be liberating. If you couldn't control your fate, why worry about it? Or it could be paralyzing, leading to resignation and despair. Different men found different ways to cope. Veterans noticed patterns, things that seemed to increase survival chances. Don't volunteer for anything. Don't be first over the top or last. Don't stand out. Don't attract attention. Learn the sounds of different shells. When to duck, when to run, when to freeze. Learn the geography of your sector, where the safe spots were, where the dangerous positions were. Experience helped, which was why the casualty rates for new soldiers were so much higher than for veterans. But ultimately, it came down to luck. A shell landed a foot to the left instead of on your head. A bullet passed through your pack instead of your spine. The gas drifted away from your position instead of into it. You lived because chance decided you would live. And tomorrow chance might decide differently. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. The armistice had been signed hours earlier, but the killing continued until the last-minute artillery firing their final shells. Machine guns chattering, men dying in the final moments of a war that had taken over 17 million lives. Then silence, a silence so profound that men who had spent years with the constant thunder of guns found it almost unbearable. There was no celebration at the front. Men didn't know what to feel. Relief, certainly they had survived, but also emptiness, confusion, grief for all those who had not survived. What was it all for? What had been accomplished? The questions had no good answers. The armies demobilized. Men who had spent years in uniform, years in the trenches, were given their discharge papers and sent home. They returned to countries that had changed in their absence, to families that had changed, to a civilian world that didn't understand what they had been through and didn't want to hear about it. The soldiers were supposed to be heroes, but they didn't feel like heroes. They had done terrible things and had terrible things done to them. They had killed men who were no different from themselves, for reasons that seemed less and less convincing in retrospect. They had watched friends die and had kept going because there was no choice. Heroism didn't enter into it. Many struggled to adjust. The nightmares wouldn't stop. The loud noises sent them diving for cover. The intimacy of family life felt foreign after the brotherhood of the trenches. Jobs seemed meaningless after the intensity of combat. Some drank. Some fell into depression. Some took their own lives. The monuments went up. The names carved in stone. The Menin Gate at Ypres with its 54,000 names of men whose bodies were never found. The Thiepval Memorial at the Somme with its 72,000 names. The cemeteries with their white headstones stretching to the horizon. The war to end all wars, they called it, because surely nothing this terrible could ever be allowed to happen again. It happened again, 21 years later. The men who survived the trenches watched their sons march off to another war, knowing what awaited them, unable to stop it. Some of the same battlefields, the same trenches, the same mud. The war that was supposed to end all wars had ended nothing. The last combat veterans of World War I died in the 2000s and 2010s, 100 years and more after the guns fell silent. They took their memories with them, the smells and sounds and horrors that no description could fully convey. All that remains are the monuments, the cemeteries, and the obligation to remember. And so our time in the trenches comes to an end. The guns have been silent for over a century now. The trenches have been filled in, the wire rusted away, the crater softened by time and weather. Where millions fought and died, farmers grow wheat and tourists walk through preserved sections of the line, trying to imagine what it was like. They can't imagine. Not really. The scale of the suffering, the duration, the conditions, these defy imagination. You can read the statistics, see the photographs, walk the ground, but you cannot know what it was like to live in that mud. to hear those shells, to lose those friends. That knowledge died with the men who were there. What remains is the question, why? Why did it happen? Why did it continue for 4 years? Why did men keep fighting when the futility was obvious, when the gains were measured in yards and the losses in hundreds of thousands? The answers are complicated nationalism, imperialism, alliance systems, the failure of diplomacy, the limitations of technology, the incompetence of commanders, the pressure of populations who wanted victory. But none of the answers feel adequate. Nothing can make sense of the Somme, of Verdun, of Passchendaele. Some things simply are, and all we can do is remember them. The men who served in those trenches were not different from us. They were young, most of them, barely out of childhood. They wanted to live, to love, to go home. They were afraid and brave, capable of cruelty and kindness, broken and resilient. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they were asked, enduring what they had to endure. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep in your warm bed, spare a thought for them. For the men who slept in the mud, who woke to the sound of shells, who lived like rats and died like flies. They didn't ask to be heroes. They just wanted to survive. Most of them didn't. The fields of France and Belgium are quiet now. The poppies grow where the blood soaked the ground. The names on the memorials are just names, belonging to men no one living remembers. But they were real, each one of them. They laughed and cried and hoped and feared. They wrote letters home that couldn't say what they wanted to say. They died far from everything they loved. Remember them, rest well. The guns are silent. The war is over. But it's never really over for anyone who was there.